And with that, we are live. All right, great. Thanks. Whoop, where'd it go? All right, yeah, now we're live. Okay. All right, so this is Chris Berry with Castle Wealth Group and your certified law attorney, certified financial planner, where we do weekly wisdom webinars, where I just hop on and answer any questions either submitted ahead of time or submitted live while we're on the call or the webinar. So if you do have a legal, financial, tax question, feel free to put in the Q&A. And I have a couple that just came in, so I appreciate that. And I always start with positive focus, just something positive. Looks like as of today, Wednesday, looks like the weather is starting to, starting to warm up, sun shining. So that's always a good thing, especially in this crazy world we're living in. So it's good to see the sun, especially after a couple of gloomy days and some unnaturally cold weather here in April and even snow. So that is good. Now with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. So give me a second here and hit that button, hit that button, hit that button. All right. All right, cool. So let me know in the chat or Q&A if you can see my screen, just if you don't mind. All right. Oh, nope, looks like we can't see my screen. That's fantastic. Let me try again. All right, so hopefully now we can, oh, gosh darn it. Zoom, you keep changing things around on me. All right, well, I'm not gonna share my screen. I see a black screen, yeah. Yep, Zoom changed something, so I'll figure that out later. So the first question that I was prepared to talk about here, let me just share my whiteboard and Zoom, and we can do it this way. All right, let me hit this button. Okay. All right, now, okay. Boop, boop, boop. You know what? Never mind. I'll just talk. Oh, gosh. All right. So the first question that came in, this was kind of submitted via email ahead of time, was asking, like, how do we fund a trust? Like, what's involved in funding a trust? So this was the first question. What is involved in funding a trust? And so first, think of a trust kind of like a piggy bank. And you know what? I'm going to grab a piggy bank. So think of a trust kind of like a piggy bank. So we have this piggy bank here. And the trust is like a piggy bank, and right now it's just an empty piggy bank. We actually have to put things into the piggy bank for it to be effective. Similarly with a trust, like if we set up a trust by itself, it's like an empty piggy bank. It's just sitting there. There's nothing actually in the trust. And so there's really two ways that we can get assets into the trust, because that's creating your rule book. That's creating your the set of rules that everyone has to follow, that your trustee has to follow. That directs where your assets are going to go upon death. That's how you avoid probate, is by creating that trust and funding it. And so there's two ways that assets can get into the piggy bank. One is we can have the trust as the owner of the asset. So this would be changing ownership of a brokerage account to name the trust as the owner, changing ownership of your home, doing a deed where now the trust is the owner. So that's typically how we set up the asset protection trust, the castle trust that we do, is we'll name the trust as the owner, because that's what builds in all of the protection. We want the trust as the owner. And with different types of accounts, we handle that differently. So with a brokerage account, we would then title that brokerage account in the trust. If it's real estate, we would deed that property to the trust. If it's a business like an LLC, we assign that business to the trust. So now it's in the piggy bank, and that builds in the asset protection if it's a castle trust, and starts that clock for nursing home or Medicaid spend down, where if we make it 5 years, 100% of what we put into that piggy bank is protected from that nursing home or Medicaid spend down. So when we're setting up asset protection trusts like a castle trust, we want as much as possible owned by the trust. Like cash value life insurance is another thing that a lot of times we'll throw into the trust. So one way is we can have the trust as the owner. The other way the assets get into the trust is we list the trust as a beneficiary. So we list the trust as a beneficiary, meaning that the trust is not the owner. We don't have to change title per se, but we have to change a beneficiary designation. On your IRAs, on your 401ks, we have to change the beneficiary to now list the trust as a beneficiary. And here's something that a lot of people forget about is that your like general checking and savings accounts at the bank, that should list the trust as a beneficiary. So you might be married and you might have a joint with your spouse. If one of you passes away, it goes to the survivor. That's fine. That avoids probate. But what happens if both of you pass away in a car accident? That's where we need to have a transfer on death or payable on death designation, naming the trust as a beneficiary. Too often when people come in and they sit down with one of us and maybe they already have a trust, but we review the funding of the trust. A lot of times they miss the checking or savings account, or they forget about the house or the real estate. A lot of times we'll do what's called a ladybird deed, a type of deed that says the home is in your name while you're alive, but upon death, it goes into the trust. So it's a beneficiary designation to the trust. So when we set up a revocable living trust, a trust that avoids probate, controls the distribution, typically we'll name the trust as a beneficiary of everything. If we're setting up an asset protection trust like a castle trust, we want the trust the owner of as much as possible. Okay, so it's a distinction between the two types of trusts and how we get the trust funded. How do we title assets, make sure everything is pointing to the trust? Because that's the key. At the end of the day, we want everything one way or another pointing to the trust. Every single asset, other than say vehicles. With vehicles, there's a simple procedure upon death where next of kin can walk in with a death certificate and they can transfer it to the Secretary of State will transfer it to next of kin. But basically everything else, anything else that really has title, we want it titled pointing to the trust. And if it's an asset protection trust, typically we want the trust as the owner. If it's a revocable living trust, typically we want the trust as a beneficiary. And then we need to make a distinction between two types of accounts. We need to talk about qualified accounts and non-qualified accounts. Qualified accounts are something that has a tax qualification. So a 401k, an IRA, a Roth IRA, a Roth 401k, a 457, 403b, all of these have some type of tax qualification. And then we have non-qualified accounts, just maybe a joint investment account or even a checking account, savings account. Those are non-qualified. And the reason we need to make a distinction is because the way that we title things, like who the primary beneficiary is, it depends on what type of account it is. So if it's a qualified account, like a 401k or IRA, if you're married, we would name spouse first and then trust, because the spouse can do what's called a spousal rollover, where typically there's a tax advantage to doing that, where now that qualified account basically becomes a surviving spouse. But then the contingent beneficiary would be the trust. We would name the trust as a contingent beneficiary. So when that surviving spouse passes away, then it flows into the trust and can go to the beneficiaries. If it's a non-qualified account, then typically we'll just name the trust as the primary beneficiary. And then if you're unmarried or widowed, we would just typically name the trust as a beneficiary. So hopefully that's helpful as it relates to trust funding. A lot of times when we sit down with someone and they already have a trust, the biggest issue is the trust isn't funded properly. And so we have someone on our team, our funding coordinator, who goes line by line to make sure every asset or account is titled properly. And also, if you do have a trust, it's important that you make sure the trust continues to be funded. So maybe you set up a trust 5 years ago, and then you opened up an account or got a new asset or you opened a new business. Well, understand that new asset needs to be pointing to the trust. It's not like the trust has to be amended or updated. It's just that new asset needs to be titled or pointing to the trust. And one of the questions that actually came in is relates to getting I-bonds from a tax refund. How do I add those to the trust? you would go to treasury.gov, and it'll have instructions on how to title those to the trust. But here's the thing, with I-bonds, you actually cannot name the trust as a beneficiary, unfortunately. And it's just one of those quirks with I-bonds. Like, you can name an individual as a beneficiary, but they will not allow you to name a trust as a beneficiary. You can open up an I-bond in the name of a trust, but you cannot name a trust as a beneficiary. So you would just name maybe your trustee or someone like that. And speaking of I-bonds, just continuing on that thought, they're really good right now still. But as we kind of get our hands around inflation, keep in mind, I-bonds historically have only given about a 1% to 2% rate of return. Granted, they were like 9% when inflation was going crazy, but chances are you might be cashing those I-bonds out within a year or so. Okay. So that's answering the question with regards to trust funding. Again, there's two main types of trusts. There's asset protection trusts, and then there's like a castle trust, and then there's revocable living trusts. The way we fund those is different. And then also understand there's really two types of assets. There's qualified accounts and then everything else. So your 401ks, IRAs, typically if you're married, you'll name spouse first and then trust. Everything else will name trust as a beneficiary. All right. So here's the second question here. Financial question. If I have too many credit cards, more than I need, does that help or hinder the credit rating? I know enough to be dangerous here, so take it with a grain of salt. And probably could do some research. I could do some research, or you could do some research on your own. But my feeling is you don't want to have too many credit cards. But that said, I know that if you close a credit card, it can affect your rating too. The bad thing with credit cards is if you have a lot of credit card debt. So I don't think it's a huge issue if you have a bunch of credit cards, but that could be answered by doing a little bit of research. I just don't know off the top of my head. All right, here's another one. So question number 3. Are you concerned about the dollar remaining reserve currency? Is there anything we should do to prepare for this case if it doesn't? Yeah. So the question is, are you concerned about the dollar remaining the reserve currency? Is there anything we should be doing to prepare in case it doesn't? And this is a question I've actually gotten a bunch from clients recently, and it is news. If you follow kind of world news and economics, you see that we're kind of getting off of using the dollar is the only currency that everyone accepts. I saw some headlines talking about like, all right, China and Brazil are like working together to get rid of the dollar and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where you look at it and it's a red flag, but what are the options? What are you going to do? Are you going to go invest in Russia or China as an alternative? No. And really the idea of the dollar and currency, or even gold and silver, it's kind of made up in a sense anyways. Like us getting off of gold, like why do we value gold? Well, like we just always have. Like if things really go bad, it's going to be all about like land, food, ammo, and guns. So I guess I think it's something that matters, but when I'm talking to clients, what I'm focusing on, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. There's stuff that matters and that's important. I think that's like important. It's kind of scary to think about. And then there's stuff that we can control. And so I try to focus on the things that matter that we can control. And in terms of like something like that, that's like this world economic issue, similarly, like going to a digital currency, like you see us kind of going down the tracks. Is it good or bad? If it's kind of out of my control. I try to look forward and see if there are like opportunities. But I don't see any specific moves there's no specific moves that we should be making just based on that. We're kind of all in it together. We can fight it as much as possible, but I think in the end, we're kind of all in it together. So hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't see anything specific with kind of where the dollar's going and how kind of it's being devalued in the world. And again, similarly, like with the conversation with like digital currencies, like in essence, like a lot of times we're just using digital currency. Like how often do you use cash or use cash to pay for things these days? It's tied to your phone or a credit card even. That's kind of like a digital currency in sense. So, all right. Here's another question. I recently received restricted stock units for my company. I'm guessing that I need to add a beneficiary to these after listening to you today, or would it be better to make the trust the beneficiary? Yeah. So the question is, I recently received restricted stock units from my company. I'm guessing I need to add a beneficiary to these after listening to you today, or would it be better to make the trust the beneficiary? Yeah. So again, if you're not married or widowed, then I always just name the trust the beneficiary of everything. Okay. Anything that you can name the trust the beneficiary, name the trust the beneficiary. There's very few things that you can't name the trust as a beneficiary. I-bonds being one of them, which someone asked about earlier. But everything else, just name the trust as beneficiary if you're a single individual or if you're widowed. If you're married, then I would name the spouse as a primary beneficiary and then the trust as a contingent beneficiary. But again, everything should be pointing to the trust. And if it's something that's like you're getting additional like company match going to your 401k and your 401k already lists the trust as a beneficiary, then it's not that, it's all going into the same account. But if there's a separate account now, then yeah, you're gonna need to name the trust the beneficiary of that. All right. Let me see, any other questions? All right. That's all I got. So thank you so much. Next week, I'll figure out the tech issues. Zoom made an update on me, so I couldn't do the whiteboard. So I apologize for that. But make it a great week. Take care. Bye-bye. 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 Thank you.